There is a version of yourself you have never actually seen. Not in the mirror, not in a photograph, not in the number staring back at you from a scale on a cold bathroom floor. You may have lost weight before. You may have watched your waist shrink, felt your clothes loosen, celebrated the small victories of discipline paying off. But underneath all of that, wrapped silently around your liver, coiled near your heart, pressed against your pancreas and intestines, something was still there. Something untouched, something invisible, visceral fat. And if nobody has ever explained to you what actually happens inside your body the moment this hidden fat begins to break down, then what you are about to read is going to change how you think about your health forever. This is not a story about willpower. It is not a lecture about eating less or moving more. This is the story of a biological transformation that begins deep inside your body, in places no mirror can reach, in systems no tape measure can assess. It is the story of what happens when your body is finally allowed to do what it has always been designed to do. And it begins not with a dramatic moment, not with sweat or strain, but with something almost imperceptible, a signal, a whisper between cells, a quiet internal decision to unlock what has been stored for far too long. Most people picture fat burning as a battle, something aggressive and exhausting, a war waged through suffering and restriction. But visceral fat does not disappear through force. It dissolves through chemistry. It responds to signals, not struggle. And understanding those signals is what separates people who transform their health from those who spend years chasing results they never quite reach. When your body senses that available energy is running low, whether through fasting, through extended gaps between meals, or through the depletion of circulating glucose, it sends out a specific internal message, not a loud alarm, more like a precise instruction passed quietly through your hormonal network. The message reads something like this: the surface reserves are insufficient. Access the deep storage. And visceral fat, due to its location directly adjacent to major organs and blood vessels, responds first. This is not coincidence. Visceral fat is metabolically active in a way that subcutaneous fat, the soft fat just beneath your skin, simply is not. It sits close to the liver. It is highly sensitive to hormonal signals, particularly insulin, cortisol, and catecholamines. If your body were a city, subcutaneous fat would live in the quiet residential neighborhoods on the outskirts. Visceral fat would have an office in the Capitol building, 3 doors down from every major decision maker. So when that signal arrives, visceral fat does not fade quietly. It mobilizes. It begins releasing free fatty acids directly into the bloodstream, flooding the portal vein that feeds directly into the liver. And here is the part most people never hear. Those free fatty acids are not just fuel, they are messages, biochemical communiques delivered simultaneously to the liver, the muscles, the heart, and the pancreas. The message is urgent and coordinated. Sugar dependency is no longer the primary strategy. Fat fuel is now online. Adjust accordingly. And what follows from that single shift is nothing short of extraordinary. The liver begins reconfiguring how it processes energy. The pancreas recalibrates its insulin output. Muscles that were previously dependent on glucose begin preparing machinery to burn fat instead. Hormones that have been shouting over each other for years begin to settle into something resembling a conversation. What looks from the outside like a person sitting quietly, perhaps feeling slightly hungry, perhaps a little distracted, is on the inside an entire metabolic government convening an emergency session. This is why visceral fat loss is categorically different from simply losing weight. When visceral fat breaks down, your organs do not just get smaller, they get better. The first and perhaps most significant early change happens in the hormonal environment, and it begins with cortisol. Cortisol is your body's primary stress hormone. In small, controlled doses, it is essential. It sharpens focus, mobilizes energy, keeps you alert.
But in the presence of chronic visceral fat, cortisol operates at a persistently elevated level, keeping your nervous system in a low-grade state of emergency. Your immune system stays on edge, your sleep is disrupted, your emotional reactions are amplified. You feel a tension you cannot quite name, a tightness in the chest, a restlessness that lingers even when nothing is visibly wrong. As visceral fat begins to dissolve, that cortisol grip loosens. And nervous system steps out of its defensive crouch. Inflammation begins to cool. And the relief that follows, the slightly deeper sleep, the subtle emotional softening, the quiet decrease in background anxiety, is not psychological. It is physiological.
It is your body recognizing that the internal state of emergency has been lifted. Then comes the insulin story, and it is one of the most important stories in modern metabolic science. Insulin resistance, the condition in which your cells stop responding properly to insulin's instructions, is one of the most widespread and underdiagnosed metabolic dysfunctions on the planet, and visceral fat is one of its primary drivers. When visceral fat is excessive, your cells behave like a room full of people where everyone is shouting and no one is listening. Insulin keeps raising its voice, sending louder and louder signals, and still glucose is not being absorbed efficiently. Blood sugar stays elevated. The pancreas exhausts itself trying to compensate. And the long-term consequences, type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, cognitive decline, are building quietly in the background. But as visceral fat shrinks, something shifts. The room gets quieter. Insulin no longer needs to shout. A whisper becomes enough. Cells begin listening again. Insulin sensitivity improves, sometimes dramatically, and the risk trajectory for type 2 diabetes begins bending in the other direction. Blood sugar stabilizes. The pancreas gets to rest. And here's the detail that surprises almost everyone. Cravings begin to change on their own, not because of discipline, not because of white-knuckling your way through hunger, but because the body is no longer in a biochemical emergency, desperately seeking fast sugar to compensate for broken insulin signaling. The metabolic chemistry shifts, and the cravings follow. Leptin, the hormone responsible for telling your brain when you have had enough to eat, plays an equally important role in this transformation. When visceral fat is high, leptin is often being produced in large quantities, but the brain has become resistant to its signal. Your body is essentially shouting that it is full, and your brain cannot hear it, so you keep eating. You feel unsatisfied. You mistake the brain's deafness for a lack of willpower. As visceral fat diminishes, leptin resistance begins to reverse. The signal clears. The brain starts receiving the message again. And for the first time in perhaps years, you feel genuinely satisfied after a normal-sized meal. Not stuffed, not restricted, satisfied. That simple shift, hunger becoming trustworthy again, changes the entire experience of eating. Now, let us talk about the liver, because no organ has a more direct or dramatic relationship with visceral fat than this one. The liver sits at the center of everything. It processes nutrients, filters toxins, regulates blood sugar, metabolizes hormones, and when visceral fat begins to break down, it receives the first and largest flood of released fatty acids through the portal vein. For a liver that has been struggling under years of metabolic overload, this initial surge is significant. But here's what makes the human body so astonishing. The liver does not collapse under the pressure. It adapts, it upgrades. Key enzymes involved in fat oxidation, particularly CPT1 and ADHD, are upregulated. The liver shifts its primary fuel source from glucose to fatty acids. It begins producing ketones, a clean-burning energy substrate that the brain and muscles can use with remarkable efficiency. Liver enzymes that were previously elevated, markers of inflammation and metabolic stress, begin to decline. Fatty liver, one of the most common and underappreciated conditions of modern times, begins to reverse. The liver transitions from an overwhelmed storage facility back into what it was always meant to be, a precise, high-performance filtration and regulation hub. A 2023 study from Washington University found that participants practicing intermittent fasting for just 8 weeks experienced an average 25% reduction in ALT liver enzyme levels, with MRI scans confirming measurable improvements in fatty liver conditions.
The liver was not damaged by fasting, it was healed by it. And then there is the inflammation question. Visceral fat is not passive tissue. It is metabolically active in a way that makes it, in essence, a chronic inflammatory organ. It continuously releases inflammatory cytokines, including TNF-alpha, interleukin-6, and resistin. These signals push the immune system into a state of constant low-grade activation. Think of it as a slow-burning internal fire, not dramatic enough to make you acutely ill, but persistent enough over months and years to damage blood vessel walls, disrupt hormonal communication, impair cognitive function, and accelerate biological aging. When visceral fat begins to break down, cytokine levels drop. Macrophages, immune cells that had been locked in attack mode, begin shifting toward repair mode. T cells recalibrate. The inflammatory environment that has been silently damaging your tissues begins to cool.
A study from the Karolinska Institute in Sweden found that just 4 days of intermittent fasting reduced C-reactive protein, a primary marker of systemic inflammation, by 30 to 40% in individuals carrying high levels of visceral fat. 30 to 40% in 4 days. Not from medication, from giving the body the space it needed to begin healing itself. The effects of that cooling inflammation ripple further than most people expect. Skin clarity often improves because the immune system is no longer perpetually inflamed. Digestion becomes smoother because gut tissue is no longer operating in a hostile internal environment. Mood stabilizes because the brain is no longer receiving a constant stream of inflammatory stress signals from below. These are not placebo effects. They are direct biological consequences of removing a source of chronic internal disruption. There is another dimension to visceral fat that almost never gets discussed, and it matters enormously. Over time, the body stores environmental toxins, heavy metals, pesticide residues, food additives, and various chemical compounds inside fat cells, particularly visceral fat cells. This is not a malfunction, it is a survival strategy. When the body cannot immediately neutralize and eliminate a toxin, it isolates it inside fat tissue to protect vital organs from direct exposure. But when fasting begins and visceral fat breaks down, that vault opens. Stored substances are released into circulation. The liver, kidneys, and lymphatic system shift into high gear to process and eliminate what has been uncovered. During this phase, some people feel temporarily worse before they feel better. Mild fatigue, brief brain fog, digestive discomfort, mood fluctuations. This is not the process failing.
This is the process working. The body is not breaking down. It is clearing out. Like any thorough cleaning, it can feel disorganized before the room looks better. One of the most quietly stunning effects of this internal cleanup happens in the gut. As inflammation drops and the toxic burden decreases, the digestive environment becomes less hostile. Beneficial bacteria, strains like lactobacillus and bifidobacterium, begin to regain their footing. And these microbes do far more than assist with digestion. They regulate immunity. They influence metabolism. They are responsible for producing the majority of the body's serotonin, the neurotransmitter most associated with mood stability, emotional calm, and restorative sleep. Research from the University of California has shown that approximately 90% of serotonin is produced in the gut. Chronic inflammation driven by visceral fat suppresses that production. So when visceral fat dissolves and the gut environment recovers, serotonin production increases. The brain receives cleaner, more consistent neurochemical signals. People report thinking more clearly. They describe feeling a lightness, not just in their body, but in their emotional experience. Sleep deepens. Irritability softens, focus sharpens. This is the gut-brain axis functioning as it was designed to function, and it begins with something as fundamental as reducing visceral fat.
The cardiovascular system tells its own version of this story. Visceral fat disrupts the balance between HDL and LDL cholesterol, encourages plaque buildup in arterial walls, drives up blood pressure by constricting the spaces through which blood must flow, and forces the heart to work harder with every single beat. The American Heart Association has referenced data showing that just a 10% reduction in visceral fat can lower the risk of heart disease and stroke by up to 30%. That is not a marginal improvement. That is a fundamental shift in long-term risk. As visceral fat melts away, arterial inflammation decreases, blood pressure steadies. The heart, no longer laboring against fat wrapped around every major vessel, begins to operate with less resistance and greater efficiency. Chest tightness eases, circulation improves. The cardiovascular system, quietly strained for years, finally gets room to breathe.
This is where the concept of metabolic flexibility becomes so important. Metabolic flexibility is the ability of the body to shift seamlessly between glucose and fat as energy sources depending on what is available. It is one of the clearest indicators of long-term metabolic health, and chronic visceral fat profoundly impairs it. When visceral fat is high and insulin resistance is present, the body becomes locked into glucose dependency. It cannot access fat stores efficiently. It cannot transition smoothly into fat-burning mode. Every time glucose runs low, there is a kind of metabolic panic. Cravings spike, energy crashes, mood destabilizes. The body lurches from one sugar hit to the next. But as visceral fat dissolves and insulin sensitivity is restored, metabolic flexibility returns. The mitochondria, the energy-producing organelles inside every cell, begin operating more efficiently. They generate ATP, the fundamental currency of cellular energy, with less oxidative stress and fewer inflammatory byproducts. The result is energy that is steadier, more sustained, and less dependent on the constant input of food. The afternoon energy crash softens. The desperate need for caffeine diminishes. Mental clarity extends further into the day. And for the first time in a long time, skipping a meal does not feel like an emergency. The hormonal reharmonization that accompanies all of this is one of the most profound and least appreciated aspects of visceral fat loss. Adiponectin, a hormone that has been suppressed by visceral fat for years, begins to rise. Adiponectin enhances fat burning, improves insulin sensitivity, and smooths out blood sugar variability. Its return is like flipping a switch on metabolic efficiency. Ghrelin, the hunger hormone that previously spiked unpredictably and chaotically, begins to stabilize. Hunger becomes something manageable and predictable, rather than something that ambushes you at random. Leptin, as discussed, begins communicating clearly again. And cortisol, no longer propped up by chronic inflammatory signals from visceral fat, settles into a healthier, more rhythmic pattern. The entire hormonal network begins moving in the same direction. Signals that were previously crossed, contradictory, and exhausting become coordinated. The metaphor that keeps returning is that of an orchestra finally playing from the same score after years of everyone improvising in different keys.
And then something deeper happens, something that goes beyond organs and hormones and even molecular biology. When visceral fat is significantly reduced, when inflammation has cooled and hormones have recalibrated, the body enters a state that researchers call repair mode. The system, no longer consumed by the effort of managing chronic metabolic overload, redirects energy towards healing. Autophagy, the body's extraordinary cellular self-cleaning process, accelerates. Damaged proteins are broken down and recycled. Misfolded cellular structures are cleared away. Cellular waste that has been accumulating for years is swept out. Skin becomes clearer because cells are being renewed more efficiently. Muscles respond faster because inflammatory interference has been removed. The immune system becomes more precise, more capable of responding to genuine threats rather than being perpetually consumed by internal ones. Organs like the kidneys and pancreas, once operating under conditions of chronic stress, begin functioning with renewed accuracy. It is a full system maintenance cycle, activated not by a pill, not by a surgical procedure, not by any intervention that costs thousands of dollars, but by the simple act of creating the conditions in which the body's own intelligence can function as it was always designed to.
The final shift is perhaps the most meaningful of all. It is not a change in a blood panel or an improvement in an organ's function. It is a change in how the body understands itself. After sustained visceral fat reduction, after hormones have stabilized and inflammation has cooled, the body's biological set point begins to shift. The autonomic nervous system, the ancient system that governs the balance between your fight-or-flight response and your rust and repair state, begins to find equilibrium. The body stops operating as though it is in perpetual danger. It stops hoarding visceral fat as an emergency reserve against imagined threats. It begins to trust the environment it is living in. Clean nutrition, stable blood sugar, genuine rest, lower chronic stress. These are the signals the body reads as safety. And when it feels safe, it stops storing in the desperate, excessive way it once did. This is the most important thing to understand about visceral fat and everything that follows its dissolution. The body is not your adversary. It has never been working against you. Every adaptation it made, every pound of visceral fat it stored, every inflammatory signal it fired, every hunger cue it amplified, was an attempt to protect you in the only way it knew how, given the inputs it was receiving. Change the inputs, and the body changes its strategy. Stop flooding it with chronic stress and ultra-processed food and sleep deprivation and glucose volatility, and it stops building the kind of fat that damages it from the inside. Give it the space to repair, the conditions to recalibrate, and it will do the rest on its own.
Because the deepest truth about visceral fat is not that it is stubborn or dangerous or difficult to lose. The deepest truth is that your body has been waiting with extraordinary biological patience for the right conditions to let it go. And the moment those conditions arrive, the transformation that follows is not just physical. It is the body remembering what it feels like to function without interference. It is your liver operating cleanly, your gut communicating clearly, your heart beating without resistance, your brain thinking without fog, your hormones speaking in a language every system can finally understand. It is not magic. It is not a quick fix. It is not a supplement or a shortcut. It is biology doing what biology has always been designed to do, given the chance. And that chance begins the moment you understand what visceral fat actually is. Not just excess weight, but a silent disruptor that has been quietly shaping how you feel, how you think, how you age, and how your body works from the inside out. Now that you understand it, you no longer have to fear it. You can work with your body instead of against it, and everything changes from there.